I feel like as a geologist, over the course of my education, I've had a lot of wonderful mentors and teachers who have helped me learn how to listen to that music. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. But before we get to that, and is it going to let me advance forward? Yay. I need to get some definitions out of the way so that we are all on the same page. So what is a soil? Does anybody want to answer that actually from the audience? What do you think a soil is?
I'll jump in. I think there's much more to soil than we think. I think there's a lot there, and I think a lot of the foundation of life itself exists just below our feet. So I'll leave it with that.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to jump in? What do you think a soil is? No one? Everybody's too shy? Okay, that's fine. So I'll tell you.
I got one for you.
Okay.
Sustenance.
Sustenance. All right.
Foundation of life as we know it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Romero. Yeah. So let's get to it. So if I ask an engineer what a soil is, they're going to tell me an unconsolidated material at the surface of the earth. And they're not wrong for their definition. If you ask a farmer, what is a soil? They might give you that definition that Dr. Romero just said, the matter, the material required to grow our food and any plants on our earth, right? And if you ask, most people, including my little niece, Selena, who is now much older than that photo, they're just going to tell you soil is dirt. That's just dirt, and nobody cares about dirt, right? But as a soil geomorphologist, I'm going to tell you something different. Okay, so your trusty local soil geomorphologist is going to tell you that a soil is a natural material formed in situ, meaning in place at the surface of the earth. It's chemically, it's physically, mineralogically, and biologically different from the parent material in which it formed, meaning rocks or sediment. And that's a really super important distinction to make, because as a geologist, as a geomorphologist, I'm thinking of soils as a tool to understand how landscape changes through time and space. And thus soils are the weathering rind of the earth. And so if we take it to this granitoid rock here, that center of the rock is that fresh, unweathered material, and everything on the outside is that weathering rind, okay? And this is very important because soils are the interface of earth systems. They are, in fact, where earth systems collide, and they make up the critical zone, okay? So everything from the top of the tree canopies to the groundwater table, that is the critical zone. And all of Earth's systems come together in that interface. And that's really important for me as a scientist, using them as a tool, that I'm drawing upon geologic principles. I'm reaching out to my colleagues in biology and forestry. I'm going to be talking with the hydrologists and engineers and meteorologists. And if I'm in the northern or southernmost latitudes, I'm going to be getting involved glaciologists and individuals who understand the cryospheres to help understand what's happening at that process level with soils. And something that's very important about soils is they are ubiquitous. There is no landform on Earth, no landscape, no continent that there isn't a type of soils. But I'm not going to lecture you on all the different types of soils. That's a whole class here that you can take. So do so. But also importantly, in the context of my research, is to also remember that watersheds are also ubiquitous. Every part of our continent, everywhere, somewhere, is a part of a watershed, okay? And watersheds, including the one that we are in, are nested. They're like those Russian nesting dolls where you have like the bigger one and then you take it apart and there's a little one, and you can just keep going and going and going until you have the tiniest watershed, right? So we can scale out and go in. This is an image of the Rio Grande watershed, and all those different colors are sub-basins, okay? And I'm going to take you to a different part of the Rio Grande watershed. So The Guyanas is a part of the Rio Grande watershed, but where I did my dissertation research is also in the Rio Grande watershed, but way up in the headwaters. Okay, so the yellow star denotes the headwaters of the Conejos River, which I'm going to call the Upper Conejos River. It is a tributary of the Rio Grande. And notice that it makes its way through the southeast San Juan Mountains, down through the San Luis Valley, where it meets with the Rio Grande. That's a really important thing. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I also want you just to take a look at the area of that of the headwaters of the Rio Grande. It's this mountainous, steep landscape. 70% of all water, sediment, and nutrients are sourced in these headwater systems. And yet, from a geomorphic perspective, especially, we know very little about these types of systems, and yet they are critical to everything that's happening downstream and everything that's happening at lower elevations. Okay, and the first thing I want you to notice about the Upper Conejos is that it has this beautiful, broad, U-shaped valley that is indicative of glaciations. And so now there's no more glaciers. So glaciers melted about 18,000 years before present, but that big U-shape was carved out by a glacier, and that's pretty amazing. And what I wanted to know in part is what's been going on in the Upper Conejos River since glaciers retreated and melted. And more importantly, I wanted to understand what was happening in these steep upland catchments, the headwaters, and how does that relate to what's happening in the base and the main axial system, that main stream. You can see as you look out into that picture, like a little glimmering meandering, that's the Conejos River. And interestingly enough, in geomorphic studies, very few, if any, people have ever gone up into these steep upland catchments and actually started to say, okay, from where are sediment and soils being eroded and then deposited in the axial system? What is the timing of that? What's going on? How do these events link up? And I was really lucky to work in an area where previous researchers had come before me and done a lot of legwork in the axial system, so I could go up into these steep headwaters and start asking some different questions. Okay, and so to give you a different perspective of that basin, this is Cornwall Mountain. In the black outline are the two tributary basins that I studied for my research. We have Sawmill Gulch and we have Robinson Gulch. Notice that they're roughly at the same elevation, they're roughly the same size. The colors that you see underneath relate to the type of bedrock that lies below them. Mostly the same there. It's a little bit of difference. All of the entire Upper Conejos area is a part of the Platoro caldera, and it's underlain by volcaniclastic rocks. But no one had ever mapped this official geology. So one of the first things that me and my field assistant needed to do was to go and dig soil pits. I mentioned to you, as a soil geomorphologist, I use soils as a tool to understand spatial and temporal landscape change. And so the circles and the triangles are really big holes that we dug in the landscape. And we use hand tools to do this, shovels and pickaxes. And I promise you, I really did do some of the digging. I didn't make all my field assistants do everything. All right, but we dug 2 meter deep holes unless we hit bedrock, water, or what I called an impenetrable clay layer. So it was always the goal to get to 2 meters unless we really just physically were not able to do so. We sampled every single soil horizon. So soils form these layers as they form. And we sampled 350 soil samples, which I then took back to UNC Charlotte and analyzed in the lab further. The culmination of this extreme physical effort was a official geologic map. I wish that there was a better way to share this with you than the screen, and it's kind of probably hard to see, but I mapped out the different superficial geologic units. And in that process, I found something that I actually didn't expect to find. And that was that Sawmill contained its own little valley glacier at the time of glaciation. And the deposits that you see there on the landscape are moraine and glacial till deposits. In contrast to that, I found periglacial pattern ground and other periglacial landforms in Robinson Gulch, and it did not contain any evidence of ever containing its own glacier during the time of glaciation. I didn't know or expect to find that, but that led me to some really interesting, I would say, directions during my dissertation. So one interesting thing is the fan in Sawmill Gulch, so the glaciated basin, it had a much smaller fan than our unglaciated basin. And this really perplexed me for some time. You can, if you look down here at the bottom, you can see fan area and fan volume. Robinson Gulch, or the unglaciated basin, fan is much larger, both in area and in volume. If you, that apron shape that you see coming out of the mountain front, classic alluvial fan, whereas Sawmill Gulch, you can barely tell that it's there, right? And so this is actually a superficial map made by my colleague Brant Kaiser, but this is again another perspective. He mapped the stratigraphy, so the timing of these alluvial fans. And one thing that I want to point out to you is the red fan that we're gonna call out almost our earliest fan. So late Pleistocene, early Holocene aged fan. And notice that it's very large in Robinson Gulch, and all subsequent aged fans are much smaller. And if you look at the one in the top left corner with the blue square, that the oldest fan is much smaller. And there's a little bit more of the middle Holocene age fan in the green. And I found that to be really interesting. And I wanted to know, how does that relate to what's been going on at the process level in these tributary basins? Okay, so again, just to remind you, that's the Robinson Gulch, the bigger fan. And it was through total, I don't know, serendipity that I even came upon this idea, because I had never studied periglacial landforms or things at the northernmost latitudes before. And I heard a talk by a researcher who was working in permafrost landscapes in Alaska, and they started showing these kinds of images, and it blew my mind, because right away I thought, wow, this looks exactly like Robinson Gulch, but modern times. And so I went down this rabbit hole of looking at thermokarst slumps, and I found that they are a beautiful analog for what happened in Robinson Gulch. Not only why it had that really big early Holocene fan, but it explained this amphitheater shape that I noticed right below the periglacial pattern ground at the headwaters of that basin. And I can show you images later of that. I think I took it out to short the talk, but that was really key in understanding why Robinson Gulch had such a larger fan, and also helped explain a lot of the morphology that I mapped in that basin. And to take it a step further, again, we wanted to know the timing of these things. And so again, just a little bit of nomenclature here. A buried soil is a past ground surface. And so that definition that I mentioned to you earlier is really important. So soils aren't something that moves around. The second you start moving it around, you're talking about sediment. Okay, so soils form in place, and we can use then buried soils to help us understand landscape evolution. Okay, because soils represent a period of past stability. And if you have one soil with another soil on top, we can interpret that. And notice the age there. I also have about 16 radiocarbon dates for charcoal found within these soil samples. And another thing to note is that weathering. So how weathered, how broken down chemically, how broken down physically a soil is proportional to age. So there are certain soil observables we expect to see in very old soils versus very young soils. And so we can use in combination of sort of these semi-quantitative or qualitative measures in conjunction with numerical measures to help us understand the ages of our buried soils. And the image on the right is actually from a fin in Robinson Gulch, where I had 2 buried soils and then the surface soil. And I used this information to actually map out and create a stratigraphic framework of soils in these basins. And effectively, I have 3 time chunks, right? So our earliest Holocene, so anything that was less than 3,500 years before present. Our middle Holocene, so 3,500 to 6,500 years before present, 1,000 years before present. Ka means 1,000, by the way. And then PH1, which is 6,500 years to 11,500 years, so just outside of the Holocene. And I've given you some examples, not only of the landforms, and terraces are just old floodplains, and alluvial fans are those apron shapes that you see coming out of mountain fronts. And what you can see here is not only the soil itself, but how it's broken down by age bracket. And I use that, and this is just sort of an example of how of the fin units. So I dug at least 3 pits per map unit that I identified. And these are the fins that I identified. And a fin is a type of wetland. And I used the numerical ages and the soil properties in order to map the soil stratigraphy in these basins. And I actually have another map that I can't show to you right here. But take that a step further, I then correlated the ages of this soil stratigraphic framework to a local paleoclimate record. So again, in the background, you see Conejos Peak, and in front of it you see a cirque, and that's that amphitheater shaped feature. And inside of that is another wetland feature that we call Saddle Creek Trail Bog. And from that, my colleagues took a core and looked at the pollen in this core in order to understand what species were present throughout time as a proxy for climate. And so what you notice here is that the youngest, that's the green rectangle here, correlates with this climate switching back and forth. The orange unit correlates with a period of initial turbulence and then relative stability in the warmer end. And obviously the oldest one here, the blue, we're coming from a cold environment to a warmer period with a little period of cold weather conditions here. And this corresponds back to the, sorry, I thought I had another picture there. I'll just go back. So I'm gonna just take it backwards just for a second. This corresponds then to the relationship between the soils in the tributary basins and the subsequent fans. Noticing that, again, coming out of that late Pleistocene time period, when we start to get things warming up, we actually had a massive impulse of alluvial sediment into the basin from the unglaciated basin. And it was a lot smaller in the basin that had glaciers. But during that period, in the middle Holocene, the fan actually was a lot bigger. So I'm going to scroll back just to give you some more context there. So we see this relationship between climate and the erosion and input of sediment into the axial system. And as we've moved forward in time, we've actually seen the sloughing off of landscape of soils from the lowest parts of the valley interfluves into the axial system. And so thinking about why do we care about this sort of process, this is Platoro. You can't really call it a town. It's actually an old mining settlement. It's right there below Platoro Reservoir, right in the heart of my field area. And when we think about, this is just one example of a small mountain community, that is directly affected by the landscapes around it. And obviously that's really near and dear to our hearts lately with everything that's happened with the fires and the flooding and our water quality. These steep mountain landscapes are intimately connected to us. And, with climate warming, it is possible we could see another influx of sediment. Platoro relies on ecotourism. They actually relatively recently, actually restored parts of the Conejos River for trout fishing. And as we know, again, from our own backyard, that sediment is a source of pollution. And so an input of sediment into the stream would damage water quality, not just for the people who live there, but also other processes and industries that rely on that clean water. And then just to kind of end that with, this image of the Rio Grande, and all the yellow that you see is what we call quaternary alluvium. So when a structural geologist or a petrologist or whoever goes out and does mapping, basically anything that's not a rock, it's just quaternary alluvium. It's just all the loose sediment. But what I want to impress upon you is that, again, if you look at the boundaries around this map, all of that sediment is being sourced from these headwaters. So while you don't see it, all that gray area, that is the source for all of the yellow that is being deposited. And the San Luis Valley in particular is a growing populace. It's a major agricultural resource center. And so the influx of sediment is really important to this particular area, as it is in most all areas. So these upland watersheds play this in the background role that we don't always quite appreciate how interconnected it is to our own process. And I really just want to leave you with even that mindset of how interconnected we are to Earth systems, right? So nothing is acting on its own, and we are all a part of the critical zone. And so with that, I just, I always want to acknowledge the immense amount of individuals who helped me achieve my field and laboratory work, as well as the sources of funding for that. And these are just some fun photos from my field area. And with that, I'll take any questions you have. I think I might be at time. So.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, anyone who wants to jump in, please do. I have a quick question for you. How do you choose the sites? I mean, is it a combination of access and what's been done there before? What I guess we would call it relative importance to our understanding of that area? Because, yeah, I mean, it's a huge area to choose from. So I'm just kind of curious how you and other scientists determine where to go and why.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And actually, I had to take out that slide because I was like, oh my God, I can't just lecture them on soil. So one of the things that we do is, at least as a soil geomorphologist, is we use this formula, if you will, called CLORT. So a fellow named Hans Jenny in 1941 figured out that soils form as a function of climate, organisms, relief, meaning landscape position, paramaterial, and time, right? And so in the framework, and that's actually a really important framework because he's basically the father of soil geomorphology, but that framework is what allows us to identify where we want to study, because we can create sequences from that. So like, for example, like I mentioned to you that the elevation was roughly the same, the paramaterial was roughly the same, the flora and fauna that live there is the same, it's the same climatic region. And so by doing so, I could create what we call chronosequences. So I can look at time. And then I basically glazed over chapters 1 and 2 of my dissertation, but another is all the chronosequences I made, and then all of the topo sequences I made. So if you hold for all the other variables, you can start changing. So that was really important to me as I chose my sites, was thinking, where can I really employ this idea of CLORT? Now, other individuals, there are other metrics depending on your study, but that's a pretty important one if you're going to do a soil geomorphic study, is really to think about the larger context of CLORT in your study.
Thank you. Questions from other folks?
Dr. Aldred.
Hi.
Hi, this is Manuel J. Garcia.
Yeah, hi, how are you doing? I haven't talked to you in a long time.
Yeah, so thanks for going over to West Las Vegas and meeting with the students. I read about that at one of the Highlands websites. So I had a couple of questions. Why is there not a glacial till everywhere? You said there was glacial till in one area, but not in another area, and they don't seem to be that very far apart. So normally we think of glaciers as like the ones that form the Great Lakes coming down from the north.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's the difference? These are smaller glaciers that formed right on the mountains, and how did they form?
Yeah, so at the time of glaciation, there would have been, again, just like you were saying, that big valley glacier that would have filled up the Conejos River Basin. But off of that, and you can see this if you, let's say, look at images of Alaska or parts of Canada, you can see that even valley glaciers have other glaciers that branch off of it. And so Cornwall Mountain, the way it would have been formed at the time of, and my interpretation is what I should say, is that Sawmill Gulch already had enough of a basin that it allowed for another little valley glacier to form inside of that basin. And whereas Robinson Gulch would have had a bit of a different morphology, and it's also a little bit steeper, and it didn't allow for a valley glacier to form in that particular basin. That's kind of like my interpretation of that. However, so like the glaciers too around Cornwall Mountain, you can actually see it really nicely in Google Earth, but the top of Cornwall Mountain was not completely covered in glaciers. It only went to about 11,700 feet, something like that. And you can actually see the pattern ground, and then what you see, nice solifluction lobes. And actually, I'm still sharing my screen, right, Julian?
Yes.
Okay, here, I'll actually go on and show you, because I had to cut out a bunch of stuff to, make the talk shorter. Here, where is it? There we go. So this is actually a nice perspective. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can see like Robinson Gulch has this really broad valley, very not too different from the main Conejos Valley, whereas this is looking down basin of Robinson. It's much steeper, it's much more V-shaped. This is all talus, which is another process often landform also often is associated with periglacial processes. And so and let's see if I don't have the other image that I was thinking that I had in here, but you can see this nice sort of little amphitheater shaped formation in Robinson Gulch that is part of a thermokarst. So I think that just as these basins formed through geologic time, they just had some different processes at play. I think at the time at which glaciers took hold. That's my, again, interpretation.
Okay, thanks. I have another question. So you're talking about altitude, and I live out east of Las Vegas in the flatlands. Mm-hmm. And in that area, there is only about 6 to 8 inches of topsoil. Mm-hmm. And below the topsoil is a bunch of caliche, which is a calcium carbonate mixture. And it's deep. I don't know how deep it is, but it can maybe go like 10 feet or more. So at one time, supposedly, it was underwater over there.
So that's actually a completely different thing. That's a really great question. And I can even talk more with you about that even at another time. I don't know if we have enough time here, but pedogenic carbonate is very common in arid dryland soils. There's actually a nice line that you can draw through the center of the United States with soils that are going to get pedogenic carbonate formation and soils that are mostly going to have your aluminum silicate accumulations. And so the formation of your caliche is the precipitation of calcium carbonate out of water. And again, if you have big, thick layers of it where it's just basically solid calcite, right? So then that's like stage 5 or 6 pedogenic carbonate formation. But you can get like up in, it's a completely different climate, up at 11,000, 12,000, 13,000 feet. But down on the alluvial fans, more in the montane ecosystem, about, let's say 9,800, 10,000 feet, you will start to see that stage 1 of pedogenic carbonate, just like the calcium carbonates on the clast itself. But we don't get big, thick pedogenic carbonate forming up in the canals. I realized I won't lose you guys. Yeah, but that's really cool. So all throughout here, throughout New Mexico, throughout Arizona, pedogenic carbonate is very, very common and a part of the soils. I will say that my colleagues that look at soils here in New Mexico tend to have to rent a backhoe if they're going to do stuff, because you can't physically pickaxe your way through the pedogenic carbonate.
No. Any other questions, folks? Dr. Romero.
Dr. Aldred, first of all, thank you for doing a presentation in lay terminology.
I did my best. I tried really hard. I didn't want to just go out.
Yeah,
So.
it was very accessible and comprehensible. And my second appreciation is you're prefacing with the idea that the land sings, the land has story, and it doesn't take not only a scientist but just a keen eye to recognize where those stories are at. And in particular, I'm glad you emphasized that point, that climate has a bearing on geology. Because when we think of geology, we tend to think in millions of years, in that geological time frame. And you're saying that, first of all, with where your research was, it's within the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years where those formations and that storytelling layers were taking place. And I think it's an excellent message for us to recognize that climate change is not on geological time scale, it's on an immediate scale. And the bearings and you did give evidence of, again, the impact on our soil and our alluvial systems from the fires and the floods that came afterwards. But that climate change doesn't take place over millions of years. Because it impacts climate, it could have an immediate bearing for us. So I think there's a powerful message to your storytelling.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I literally just got done telling my physical geology students that this morning, that, why do we care about all this stuff, is that it has a story to tell, and it's really important for the story that we're currently a part of. And so, there's, uniformitarianism, founding principle of geology is the present is the key to the past. And so I feel like, a lot, my counterparts might be studying longer timescales. Those are certainly important as well, but there is a story to be told in more recent times. So thank you.
Other questions, folks?
I just wanted to ask really quickly, when was the last time you were up in the Platoro area, and what changes have you seen in sort of the region over the last several years, decade or so?
Yeah, thank you. And I know that don't you all have something up there in the Conejos?
Yeah, my folks when I was a kid, my folks built a cabin on Rough Creek, which is one of the tributaries of the Conejos that comes down a little bit south of Rocky Mountain Lodge there.
Yeah.
About 28 miles south down the road from Platoro. And we were up there just last weekend, not this last weekend, but the one before, Labor Day weekend. And it's striking when you go up into those little canyons, not the main Conejos Valley so much, but the the side canyons, the fire danger up there just looks colossal because you have these huge stands of firs and about every other tree is dead now.
Yeah.
And, you know, going up thousands of feet from the valley floor. And, you know, I'm very worried that there's going to be a lightning strike or someone's going to drop a cigarette butt and you're going to get a, you know, something akin to what we saw around here taking place, at least in those narrower canyons. And I can't help but think that that's a consequence of climate change. You know, it just seems like I've been going up there for more than 50 years, and it just seems like just in the last 10 years, the number of trees that have died, you know, and the glut of this sort of dead vegetation, you know, down trees, that it's really going to be, you know, it's not a question of if there's going to be a major fire up there, but when it's going to happen.
Well, I mean, that's a key problem. And that, I mean, as you mentioned, we had that issue here, and individuals who have been coming to these forests for decades pointed out the fact that, you know, our forests look like tinderbox, and we really have to change the way in which we are managing our forest. And I agree with you. Like, you can see also sort of the change of speciation, because it's getting warmer, right? So things that you expect to see at lower elevation, they're creeping their way up, you know, and we definitely make that observation as well. It has been a while. The last 2 times I tried to go up to Platora, which has been in recent times, I've ran into various weather issues, and I don't have the proper vehicle, but I'm actually really hoping to get up there soon. It has been too long, but even in the time when I was actively going up there every year, even just summer to summer. So in 2011, there was a forest fire on the other side of Wolf Creek Pass. So like go on the other side of Wolf Creek passes, like going down towards Pagosa and the San Juan River, you know, and then 2012 was an even worse drought, an even worse fire, you know, and the smoke. That was actually my first real interaction with forest fire, was in 2012 out there, and then 2013. And it's just been that way. And we can look at that, and there's a lot of data showing the impacts that our warming climate is having on these rivers, even at high elevation. It's really an issue. Again, really the whole point of my talk, I realized I was running out of time, and I like had to just wrap up some of my thoughts. But you know, one of the things I really wanted to, I guess, hit home on is this intersection, right? It is imperative that geomorphologists and geologists and foresters and ecologists and biologists and meteorologists, atmospheric scientists, everybody be working together to solve these issues. It's not going to be solved in just one discipline's way of thinking, right? We have to work together to solve this issue, and it is imperative. It's upon us. It's not even a future crisis. It's a crisis right now that we are in. So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got another question. Going back to the morphology of tributary basins, if you look at the unglaciated basin, it looks like to me, you know, being a layperson, that looks more like a glaciated basin. Looks like a bulldozer went in. Look.
Yeah, no, that's the funny thing, Manuel. When I first picked out these basins and I'm looking at the topo map and looking at things, I thought, okay, well, here's 2 glaciated basins in this glaciated valley. And, you know, I 100% expected to, you know, so I mapped some, I mean, it takes a long time to like hand dig 2-meter deep holes. We did 28 in Sawmill and 20 in Robinson. And so that first summer I was just mapping Sawmill Gulch, and I came up with my mapping scheme and, you know, mapped everything. And I'm like, okay, good to go. Next summer, go back out. And I go into Robinson and I'm like, well, this doesn't work, because I'm not seeing moraines. I'm not seeing till deposits. I saw debris flows deposits, and I saw thermokarst slumps, and I was seeing, and actually I didn't have the terminology. I just knew it wasn't what I was used to looking at. I can go hike up Cornwall Mountain, Caneos Mountain, and I can go to Saddle Creek Bog, which is in a cirque, and be like, this is not what I'm seeing over in Robinson. And I was like, what am I looking at? And then I finally, like I said, I had this opportunity to hear a talk, and I was like, oh my goodness, I think I'm looking, and I went down the rabbit hole, and I was like, wow, that really helps put things in perspective and makes a lot of sense. But I thought the same thing. I was like, I thought it was just going to be standard, all the same morphology, but it was in fact very different. And Robinson's also a lot steeper as well, like in some of its lower valley interflows. That perspective that I just showed, actually, that I think is still in the background, it looks a little wonky because of the perspective, but it's just this steep cliff within talus that goes into the main channel of Robinson Gulch. But yeah, it was totally surprising but when you're out there, and that's also like one of the things about when you learn how to read the landscape as a geomorphologist, and I'm looking at this, I'm not making it up, what are the soils telling me? What are the class sizes of the soil? How has it weathered? Those are the things that are telling me the story, as Dr. Romero might say, is me interpreting this evidence as it's presented. So it was truly shocking find.
Okay, another question, and then I'll let somebody else. So Mr. Linder asked the question about made a comment about the trees being dry. Have you heard that we may not have evergreens in the next 20 to 50 years because they're going to die out and the deciduous trees are going to take over because the evergreens will not be able to handle the temperatures?
Well, what you see is with things like that, they might become absent from our landscape or the headwaters of the Rio Grande. That might actually happen. But if you